Thank you very much, Chair. Tom, if I could just carry on the questioning with you. We've in the discussion we've had today, there's been a lot of talk about the comprehensive plan that the government needs to put forward, covering all sectors. So we've had transport, we've had heat and homes, all sectors to achieve net zero. But actually, isn't the lesson of the last 100 years that government's really bad at planning economies? And by far the better mechanism for achieving change is by unlocking the strengths of the free market. And in this context, does that mean that we need to have simply a strong and rising carbon price, and then we can get the free market to solve these problems for us? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. So I think there's different routes to net zero, and it's perfectly legitimate. Some countries might choose to take a more sort of state planning type approach to net zero. Some countries might prefer to take a more sort of market-based approach. I think there are strengths and weaknesses to both, and ultimately you're going to need a blend. You know, these are areas where probably the market cannot deliver all of the change that you would need to see, or it wouldn't be the most efficient way. But certainly a lot of the innovation and a lot of the change is going to require the market, and I think that's probably the approach that we would be more tended towards in the UK. I don't think being more market-based, and that's certainly the kind of direction of this government, I don't think that precludes you from needing to set out a really clear net zero strategy, because that net zero strategy might just actually set out how you want to utilize the market to drive progress in each of the areas that you want to do that. And if I could just add a bit to what I said earlier about the different sectoral plans, I think there's a real risk that we see a string of perfectly reasonable sectoral plans. You know, Chris was talking about actually the transport decarbonisation plan. It's got very good things in it. If those are all just made in unison, a set of perfectly good sectoral plans will not add up to a very good net zero strategy necessarily. The whole point about net zero is that it is a systems challenge where the different progress in different areas is interrelated, and actually doing one sector alone isn't going to work. The Council on Science and Technology wrote a very good letter to the Prime Minister on this. So I think you do need, you know, even if you're taking a very market-based approach, you do need someone at the centre to have a clear view on how you're going to deliver it sector by sector and how those things interrelate.
Yeah, I quite agree that sometimes having a clear market signal, for example, the announcement that we're going to be phasing out the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles, that's great for setting a clear direction for a market, and then the market can then move in to start solving those problems. But isn't the biggest market signal of all a price for carbon?
Yeah, so I think you're right to mention that. I mean, certainly most economists, most experts would look at carbon pricing and say it is the most efficient way to drive carbon out of your economy. In the UK, we haven't used particularly aggressive carbon pricing, and we've got a range of different carbon prices across different sectors. What's been quite interesting for me to see is actually a bit more of a sort of coalition building around the need for strengthening carbon prices. I think some of that comes from what's happening abroad. We see developments in the EU around a stronger ETS, not agreed yet, so we'll have to see what happens there. But, you know, if other countries, the EU and the US, start to put in place those sorts of trading schemes, then we would be at a real disadvantage if we didn't raise carbon prices here. I think they also help you in driving some of the consumer changes that we talked about earlier. One of the real risks that I see with this transition is if you don't give people the right incentives, then behavior simply isn't going to change. So to take an example of that, we're going to see more and more people switch over from driving petrol and diesel vehicles to driving electric vehicles. Now, at the moment, the government doesn't seem to start to want to talk about road pricing. You saw that in the transport strategy. You also saw it in I think the Treasury's evidence to the Public Accounts Committee, that they sort of said this is a long time away, we're not really talking about it yet. If you don't have something that's going to replace that, then actually you're just encouraging people to drive more and more, even if that's low emission vehicles. So I think we need to see a combination of the two, but certainly, you know, there is scope to be much more ambitious on carbon pricing.
So Chris, if I could just move that question on to you. It's fair to say, I think the government's much keener on carrots than sticks when it comes to changing behaviour. When it comes to the carbon price, what's your view? Do you think we should be focusing more on carbon price and letting the free market find out the best way to solve these problems?
Well, I mean, just as Tom says, there's many ways to skin this particular cat. But in all worlds, regardless of your outlook on this, you need that strong carbon price. So, really important to say that carbon pricing is absolutely essential as you know, one of the primary components of the transition. But it is a blunt tool, and it does tend to have regressive impacts, which can make them quite politically unattractive. So you need to not just consider the carbon price, but also consider what compensating actions you're putting in place alongside it. It's really important, I think, therefore, that it's not the only tool. So I can make that point again, and of course everyone says that it's easy to do so, but alongside the very strong signal that comes from the carbon price, it's actually more effective and cheaper if you accompany that with a suite of other measures. That's certainly been the experience that the UK has had. Really important to think alongside the carbon price of what standards need to be set, what regulations need to be put in place, what incentives need to be offered in, of course, the appropriate places. Maybe a couple of examples just to bring that alive. And you mentioned the phase out of electric vehicles. That's a policy that's based on a standard or a regulation. And it's, I think, the right policy. And we now know that will be accompanied by a mandate from manufacturers, again, another regulatory policy. We could try and achieve the same outcome with a fuel duty escalator. I would suggest that's not going to be a very popular thing to do for the Chancellor, nor would it stick. In fact, setting a standard, backing that up with a mandate for manufacturers is a much better thing all round, because it gives a clear signal that something has to be done by a certain date with sufficient time to plan for that, especially to industry, also to the consumer. And I would say that creates the space for market forces then to come in and bring the cost down of those cars. The other example, which often comes out of the literature, is energy efficiency. It's a really good approach to set tougher standards to improve energy efficiency for products that are sold. You know, the televisions that we use, all the light bulbs, all the fridges, they're all much more energy efficient than they used to be. Consumers haven't had to incur higher carbon pricing to achieve that outcome. It was done with stronger standards. So I think what we need is a bit of clarity about this. I mean, I think you do need the sectoral plans to be in place, partly because industry and consumers need to know what's coming. And then that frees up the space for more traditional market forces to come into play. And carbon pricing is such an important background piece of information for the consumer there. So it's a combination of those things that has led to the success we've seen in the power sector, for example. It's the idea that I think we could replicate that in other sectors.
Yeah. Of course, I'm slightly conscious of the time, but we're not an economy in isolation. We're a part of a global economy, and different countries are approaching decarbonisation at different rates. So given this, how important do you think a carbon border adjustment mechanism could be for the UK's transition to net zero by 2050?
It's potentially very important, but of course there's a set of things that we need to decide that we want to do before that. I mean, a really interesting document was published today by the Board of Trade on green trade, and a really interesting section on carbon border adjustments, and I definitely would recommend a read of it. They are very much, of course, in vogue at the moment, thanks to the EU's new package of climate reforms. In our work in the Climate Change Committee, we have floated carbon border adjustments, and they are certainly promising as a tool to drive global emissions down. I do worry, that said, that they introduce the risk of protectionism, even if that is green. So we are going to need strong trade, healthy trade, for many of the global transitions to be successful. Think of the electric vehicle transition, for example, or all the energy infrastructure that will need to be moving around the world. So I think the general view that you will find in that paper published today is one I really agree with, that really we first need to look at the multilateral solutions for this to address the ongoing risk of what we call carbon leakage. That is one of the big issues, therefore, that I think faces the UN process and COP26. We're in the presidency of that. So a collective agreement to adopt more ambitious standards across the globe would be a much better outcome, I think, all round. I also quite like the way the Board of Trade have looked at carbon border adjustments as something that needs to come later, after you've initiated that global dialogue. So that idea of starting that first, building a better understanding of whether carbon leakage is as big a problem as some say it is. We actually don't know very much about that. And then focusing efforts in the early years, especially on finding common international product standards for carbon-intensive products that would apply here at home and to the things that we import. The idea then is that you've got that strong carbon price and potentially a carbon border adjustment as a sort of backstop, I suppose, as a complement to those efforts. And I think that's something that's quite appealing overall. Last thing I just want to say on that, though, is the existence of something like a carbon border adjustment doesn't guarantee that we're going to decarbonise British industry. We still need to focus on the things that actually will be needed to decarbonise those industrial processes. That's about investment here in the UK. The sooner we make that investment, the sooner we have cheap zero carbon energy in the UK, the sooner we can actually start reshoring industries. So reshoring zero carbon industries that are going to employ people in green jobs. I'm afraid that will require taxpayer funding, because we know that the industry will have to be shielded from some of those costs, at least, over that transition. So our advice certainly is get that done quickly, and then you have a zero carbon sector that you can start to grow.
I think the argument for an earlier adoption of a CBAM than the 20s and 30s and 2040s, which the government appears to be hinting at the moment, is that it's not until you've got that, I don't want to say protection at the border, but that level playing field at the border.
Yeah.
So it's only when you've got that you can raise essentially the price of energy in your domestic market and allow your domestic manufacturing to be reshored, because you're not being unfairly competed with on price of carbon. And if we have to wait until the 20s and 30s and 20s and 40s before we can start revolutionising the productive processes in the UK economy, that feels like a missed opportunity to me. I was just wondering if I can move on. Just the final
very
question.
briefly, Jerome. I'm afraid we're running out of time.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that, Chair. I was at with the Australian High Commissioner last night, celebrating the free trade agreement that we've just had with Australia. But do you have concerns about trade deals and that they could lead to carbon leakage in areas which are energy intensive, like farming and heavy intensive manufacturing?
Gosh, I mean, I don't think I can answer that question straightforwardly. I mean, partly because it's unclear the degree to which carbon leakage is an issue. I mentioned that earlier. It's not clear the degree to which we have outsourced industries. It doesn't look like it's something that's happening if you look at the recent manufacturing data, for example. It's also, I think, unclear the degree to which liberalised trade after Brexit would create the conditions that you talk about. But there is certainly a risk. For example, I mean, the best example is definitely agriculture. So the risk that we will be buying cheap meat from far-flung places and exporting those methane emissions that are presently here in the UK is definitely something I'm sure that farmers are concerned about. I suspect those risks are overstated. Our primary trading links are still with the EU, especially for food. I think that the most interesting thing I can say about it is that this is an opportunity, I suppose, that in these new trading arrangements, we can enshrine the climate objectives more clearly than they are enshrined at present. And I would extend that to the broader question of the environment as well. It might be too much of a stretch, but I would love to see new trade deals that covered the need for strong environmental protection as a core. And I very much hope that's something that Liz Truss is thinking about, because I can see then that there is the potential for these not to be a risk, but instead actually a kind of a support for the general strategy of decarbonising, because we can decarbonise here in the UK, but of course we are responsible for a bigger carbon footprint than the emissions that we are measuring directly.
I'm going to cut you short there, because we could talk for hours on this one subject alone, and I'm trespassed enough on the chair's goodwill.